Welcome to There's Sometimes a Buggy, Irresponsible Opinions about Classic Film. I'm Elise.
I'm Dave. This week we return to the Hollywood studios year by year. It's Warner Brothers 1947, and we've got Possessed and Dark Passage for you this week. Also, stay tuned after that discussion for Fear and Moviegoing in Toronto, where we will be examining a couple of disparate films once again. Alien from 1979 and Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express, which we saw at the Review Cinema.
Very different moods.
You said it. As always with Hollywood Studios Year by Year, we'll begin with the Hollywood story and our chart of personalities under contract to the studio that year. This is Joel W. Findler, and his 1, 2, or 3 star rating has come under a great deal of scrutiny during the course of our adventure through the studios these many years. Ida Lupino has 2 stars. Bette Davis, 3 stars, still the queen of the lot in 1947, although a serious challenge has been posed. Sidney Greenstreet, 1 star. Eleanor Parker, 2 stars. Humphrey Bogart, 3 stars. Joan Crawford, our challenger as queen of the lot, 3 stars. Lauren Bacall, 2 stars. Errol Flynn, 3 stars. Anne Sheridan, 2 stars. Jane Wyman, 2 stars. Ronald Reagan, 2 stars. And that's it. We're going to hear from Clive Hirschhorn, the Warner Brothers story, his little review. Already the proud possessor of 1 Academy Award, Joan Crawford clearly wished to gain a 2nd for Possessed. Accordingly, and very effectively, she emoted in her role as a schizophrenic woman, overtaken by the intensity of her feelings and the frustration of her unrequited love for Van Heflin. She got neither the Oscar nor Van Heflin for her efforts in the highly charged Sylvia Richards' Ranald McDougall screenplay, from a story by Rita Wyman, with powerful direction to match by Curtis Bernhardt. Also cast were Raymond Massey, Geraldine Brooks, Stanley Ridges, John Ridgely, and Moroni Olson. The producer was Jerry Wald.
So do you think that Louise had a cat between the ages of 9 to 12?
I made the mistake of introducing Elise to a news story that's making the rounds today about proximity to cats increasing your tendency to develop schizophrenia. I don't know what we can attribute her problems to, but they are certainly monumental.
So I have a very close relationship with this film. We'll unpack that momentarily. I don't know anything about your relationship to it, so tell me about that first.
Oh, I've always thought this was great. It's definitely one that I saw on TV when I was a kid. They played it on PBS. I taped it off TV. I had both Crawford movies called Possessed. They're both great, but so totally different from one another. All those late 40s Crawford films.
Many of them produced by Jerry Wald.
Yeah, I mean, they're real peak Warner Brothers stuff. I saw this after Mildred Pierce. That predisposed me to seek out anything else that might be in the same vicinity. This does have the same screenwriter and the same star, and as Hirschhorn points out, the same ambition to land another Oscar. Top-notch movie.
So when I first saw this movie, I was in unrequited love. Definitely very obsessed with A Poor Man. I felt like I was Joan Crawford in this movie. Even though I was not exhibiting my feelings, I was completely trying with everything in my power to conceal that this was going on. But I felt every minute like I was Joan Crawford in this movie. The scene where she just goes completely nuts at the nightclub where she runs into him with her stepdaughter.
Talking very loud and giving a very bad impression of sophisticated banter.
And then laughing her head off.
With no one joining her.
And then that's a famous dissolve that you see on Twitter all the time. The image of her with her head thrown back in insane laughter and then her looking distressedly later that night in the mirror. So obviously at the time this movie had a very powerful emotional impact on me. And despite how horrifying it was to watch, I just wanted to watch it again and again, and I've seen it so many times. I've seen it so many times and I know all the lines of dialogue, and every word, every frame, every moment is imbued with emotional charge for me, and I love the screenplay and I love the way the actors deliver their lines, love the cinematography, I love the sets. That's why I gave this as one of my examples of, because Curtis Bernhardt, not known either as an auteur or as one of the directors who were considered great Hollywood directors at the time, like Cooker or Wyler and Irving Rapper with now Voyager. I gave those two as a couple of examples of Warner Brothers as a studio by the 1940s that was itself an auteur and was just making these extraordinary melodramas that didn't need a director of genius. This movie's just a masterpiece as far as I'm concerned. It's been a while since I last saw it.
Well, we saw it at the theater before COVID when TIFF did their Joan Crawford spotlight.
Did we? Because I can never remember anymore. If I've seen a movie, I am so spoiled by this point from having lived in Toronto for so long that if I've seen a movie both on the big screen and not, I often can't remember if I have seen it on the big screen. Anyway, so what I really noticed on this viewing, I noticed her performance more than ever. And we just saw Woman Under the Influence, and although obviously that's a completely different kind of movie and a completely different kind of performance, I feel like Crawford just about matches Gina Rollins for her intuition, leaving aside some of the ridiculousness of the portrayal of insanity in this movie. A lot of it is not ridiculous. A lot of it seems very accurate, but also relatable, even if you are not experiencing psychosis, even if you're just experiencing the psychosis of love. Yeah, I feel like this is almost as good in its way of a performance as Gina Rollins in Woman Under the Influence. And I always, out of the four big studio era actresses, Davis, Stanwyck, Hepburn, and Crawford, I always underestimate, and I feel like this is common, Crawford as an actress.
I think that's becoming less common.
Just feel like her intuitions as an actress in this role are so good, and her performance is so modulated. There are so many different inflections, and it goes all the way from incredibly quiet to incredibly huge and loud, sometimes in the same scene. It's not just big acting throughout the whole thing. It's also a movie that, like so many of her Warner Brothers pictures, extrapolates from the Crawford persona and builds the Crawford legend. There's so many movies from this period, and certainly the one that comes to mind is Humoresque, where Crawford's mind is associated with water, with turbulent water. Her emotions are just oceanic. Dark and oceanic.
These are big concepts you're introducing.
Well, I've thought a lot about this movie.
Good.
So this is about Joan Crawford's persona and what she brings to the screen as an actress, and these titanic, oceanic, turbulent emotions are certainly part of that.
An elemental force, and much more than Van Heflin wants to deal with.
Van Heflin's performance is so wonderful in this movie.
It's interesting because, of course, what we're trying to do here is get a bead on studio personality, studio auteurism. But we do have to say that while Crawford was settling in as a Warner Brothers star by this point, Van Heflin was an MGM property even at this time. He was on loan. Crawford, her whole persona was formed at MGM. So it's pretty interesting to find these two MGM refugees in Warner Brothers' world. And maybe just to link ourselves back to MGM 1947, where we also had a Curtis Bernhardt film set partly in an institution or a mental hospital.
Right, the film he made before this, High Wall.
There may be a convergence going on. Noir, in a sense, is diluting the barriers between the studios, or between many of the studios. And it's just all of Hollywood is getting into the act and producing a large quantity of brilliant film using this new aesthetic as a key to inquiring into the malaise besetting modern society.
Which is how this movie begins. Or anyway, that is part of the medical, clinical framing of the movie.
A flashback movie for the most part, although we do get some scenes set in present day with Joan Crawford wandering around asking for someone called David.
Looking like a waxwork, a walking waxwork.
Just accosts various people, although very gently, and says, David, I thought I'd lost you. David, she doesn't seem to be looking for anyone that looks a particular way as just any man. She doesn't grab a woman and call her David. That's the only distinction she seems to be able to make anymore. She gets on a trolley car and asks for David, and the conductor tells her, there's no David here, you may as well get off. She goes into a diner, doesn't actually order a coffee, but sort of attracts one as a default order, and then collapses. She's brought to a ward where first the emergency medical technicians, or I guess emergency doctor on duty, look at her. They try to rule out purely physical causes.
We do get some POV shots, her on her stretcher being wheeled around, but it's the POV shot of a comatose person.
Puts you in that position. What would happen if you had a complete nervous breakdown and wound up in this situation? And yeah, I think the movie is trading on the fact that most people wonder about that at least a few times in their lives. Like, I feel like I could just be carted off any moment if I don't calm down. And she just doesn't calm down. And she's brought to this point. She's in shock. There doesn't seem to be any physical cause that they can determine. So they say, send her to psycho. And they start to try to get to the bottom of it. And I mean, there's so many things linking this movie and High Wall. Of course, we would never have known that or thought about it if we hadn't watched them so closely together. But we've also got this truth serum treatment again.
I did see somebody complaining about this movie online on the basis of a male medical professional, voice of authority, mediating, explaining, and exculpating women's emotions or mental health to the audience.
By design, to some extent. I think you're supposed to feel like, well, maybe this guy knows what he's talking about, or maybe he's oversimplifying, and the real center of attention is Joan Crawford, and the chaos going on inside her seems to belie the
soothing, patriarchal...
the easy diagnostic terms that he's applying to this monumental crisis.
Yeah. But it is interesting that, as we were saying, he uses the Freudian approach, as opposed to the kind of, maybe in a way we've circled back to this in psychiatry, paying attention to material circumstances, to social causes, after perhaps a long detour talking only about what happens in brains and because of genetics. But, the original Freudian position that this doctor is representing, it talks about how our civilization is responsible for people succumbing to various forms of madness, and how you never know when you're going to get a person who is capable of being triggered by that. It could be anybody.
There's a lot of pressure, and some people are going to crack. It's not easy to determine where the fissures are going to appear and how vulnerable they're going to be. Obviously, Freud tried to locate most of the original wounds and the cracking in childhood, which later is exacerbated by adult experiences.
What we see here is we're presented with an ordinary middle-class woman.
Yeah, we don't get a single mention of her family or any look back. It's a flashback movie. They could have gone back to when she was a kid and some telling incident or some parental misjudgment that put her on a collision course with insanity, but we don't have any of that. We just meet her at a happy moment in her life.
We find out that the one thing that we do know that set her up for what happens is that they apply some psychobabble of typical schizoid detachment, but we are also trusted to interpret what's happening in our own way, and the movie itself uses language of love and gender. The movie, not the framework. Not the medical framework. So there are competing discourses about what's going on. As I said, what we learn is that she was emotionally repressed before she met this man.
Yeah, that's all she says. She meets Van Heflin and she starts to see the world in Technicolor. Before that, she wasn't sad, she wasn't happy, she was just existing.
And this is the language of romance, right? Even in lots of 1940s, sort of lush, dark romances. My life began when I met you. And what do you think of that moment where... and this is another moment of clashing between this, again, calming, soothing, reassuring, patriarchal medical discourse and whatever the fuck is going on with Joan Crawford when he asks her very paternalistically, well, can you tell me how you feel, right? And she finally manages to croak out with her... And I was watching Crawford in the bed while they're talking, and she manages to not blink for minutes at a time. And then she just croaks out her, I feel feel like
Yeah.
it's just beyond the grave, this voice from beyond the grave.
Of course, she becomes quite loquacious once sodium pentothal, or whatever it is administered. And we get her narrating this brief pinnacle of emotion and the crash that comes right after it because she scares Van Heflin off with...
Well, initially, what seems to be happening... Well, he does say that he's noticed that this is a problem before, but initially all that seems to be happening is that he realizes that this woman needs more from him than he can give. That he just wanted a light, casual affair. He says knowing her has been wonderful, but he is not looking to... He seems to actually appreciate the person she is at the beginning of this movie, like a very emotional, very sensitive person, but he just knows that he is not going to be able to satisfy her.
Yeah, well, he says, for you, shoeman. You know, I mean, he's got a sense of who she is.
Tenderness.
Yeah, but not what he wants long term. I think Van Heflin gives a great performance in this movie. He really treads a difficult path here because we have to feel the deadly blows he is raining upon Joan Crawford's psyche and heart, but we also get a sense of his perspective on all of this. He's just someone who didn't want to get married. I mean, does he have to die for that? He's not unnecessarily cruel to her. There are a couple...
He is. Look, I was really watching the phases of Van Heflin in this one, and that's why this character and this performance are so fantastic. I do feel like he gets thrown under the bus a little bit toward the end, perhaps to justify the star killing him. Let me describe the phases and then you can comment. So initially, here in this first scene, his perspective is understandable. Both of their perspectives are understandable, let's say, right? You can already tell. I mean, we know she's going to go crazy, and we can already see the signs of that in this first scene, but for now, both of their perspectives are understandable. He talks about being adrift. You know, maybe it's the war, something as maybe incapable of being satisfied, incapable of settling down. We've heard men talk this way in wartime movies. We heard...
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine how Joan Crawford would have reacted to dealing with Tyrone Power in The Razor's Edge?
I was thinking of Dana Andrews in My Foolish Heart. He says something almost identical to that. Like, he just doesn't know that war has made him so unsettled in his mind that he doesn't know what he can commit to. Of course, he's actually a soldier, so that's a little different.
Yeah, I mean, that's before he goes away. There's something there, but I think more the problem of the returned soldier who feels aimless. I mean, that's something that is explored in a lot of noir.
So there's that initially. So he's trying to make a humane break with her, but the crazier... But then he goes to see... I guess already we see the side of him that is a user. So maybe it's not so much throwing under the bus what happens later. The side of him that uses women when he comes back and talks to Raymond Massey about the job, because he has gotten this information about this plum job from Joan Crawford's character. But given that, it makes it all the better how Van Heflin plays this character, starts from a point of sympathy and only brushes up against the edge of villainy toward the end of the movie, right? When he could have just played it as a villain the whole way along.
He's just a normal guy. He's trying to get ahead in his profession. He cares more about mathematics and engineering than anything else. He wants to make money. To me, I mean, his attitude, his whole approach to her changes after she looks crazily at him and tells him that she'll lie and do anything she needs to do to destroy his career and put him in wrong with his new boss. I mean, that's, yeah, at that point, there's a more adversarial situation going on between them.
But then he comes back from Canada and visits his boss again and meets up with her again. And at this point, he's just dealing with a crazy woman and he's just kind of trying to navigate that. And he's starting to get annoyed.
Yeah.
But he doesn't really know what to do, or like how could you, or how deep it's going to run. Now he starts really letting himself in for trouble when he goes to the wedding just to amuse himself because he just wants to see some more of Joan Crawford acting crazy.
And then he winds up, meeting a much more manageable love interest for him, Geraldine Brooks.
I love the relationship between these two. She doesn't want him to be any different. She's attracted to him for the same reason that Joan Crawford is, which is that he's emotionally unavailable. This is what makes him charming to women. And she's just as much of a crazy, aggressive pursuer as Crawford is. The difference is she doesn't want him to change, and she doesn't need him to pour out his emotions on her. Therefore, they seem extremely compatible, and that, to me, that would have been enough of a reason for them to marry, and they didn't need to throw in this admission of his that he is doing it for her money.
Yeah, well, I don't think he really is doing it for her money. I think
he says he is.
He says that to piss Joan Crawford off even more. He clearly really likes Geraldine Brooks. The way that they come around to getting married is exactly the kind of thing that's going to work for him, because she's like, you think we could make it more than a few years? Like, he loves that.
She's not going to, what does he say, suffocate or choke him to death.
No, and if it doesn't work out, she's going to be okay. But she really is attracted to him and wants to get married. I mean, so it's like the best of all possible worlds. And she's very attractive herself. So, yeah, you could see how an inveterate bachelor like Heflin's character would make an exception for Geraldine Brooks here.
And they're just so fun together.
Yeah, he's not just having a blast here because he's really worried about what Joan Crawford's going to do to him. And he's very nervous whenever he's summoned over to Geraldine Brooks's side. And he's not relishing any of that. I can't deal with Joan Crawford anymore. Now that I've met this other person, I just want a nice, quiet, normal life. I'm done laughing at everybody else. I want us to have our own fun in a different space that doesn't involve Joan Crawford. But he can't get away from her because Crawford is his prospective mother-in-law.
And I think this might be the first time I've watched this movie and actually thought about, like, what are the family dinners going to be like when Crawford recovers in a few months, according to the doctor.
Yeah.
It'll just take a few months of extreme, extraordinary, unbelievable suffering.
Hopefully Geraldine Brooks is going to be able to manage and live happily without Van Heflin because he is dead.
Alright, so those are the many phases of Van Heflin's character, and he performs them all beautifully with a light touch, even when Joan Crawford is manhandling him like she's about to beat him up. So he has so many amazing lines in this movie. I seldom hit a woman, Louise, but if you don't leave me alone, I'll end up kicking babies.
I mean, you could see why they wanted to borrow him. Warner Brothers.
But he doesn't usually give a performance like this absolute cad who's still grounded in some kind of sympathetic human reality.
Well, I think Van Heflin's an actor who really demands reappraisal. He is one of the most important stars of the 40s for me. He made some truly great films. Think about Strange Love of Martha Ivers. I mean, he's playing a character that's not so different from this, but he's cast in a much better light by the developments in that film. He's dealing with an equally crazy, equally dangerous woman in that movie, and irritating her and seducing her, and that when he gets away. But yeah, so I could see the people that made this movie, I feel like, had to have been thinking about his performance in Strange Love.
But as great as Van Heflin is, he is no match for Joan Crawford, so we should probably start talking about her performance and her character.
She's great in the scenes where she goes full throttle mental, but much more important are the scenes where she's just starting to talk a little too fast and a little too loud.
Okay, well, let's start at the beginning of the movie, though, and part of what's so great is that initially, and so believable, is that initially her illness only involves him. When she's around him, she's completely out of her mind. And this is where it also becomes believable, this emotional repression that she was talking about. Because then when she switches to her professional role as a nurse in this household, in Raymond Massey's household, she is very, very rational and very impersonal.
Well, so rational that Raymond Massey depends upon her as his anchor and tether to reality.
Because he's got a mad woman in his house, right? Who is paranoid about him and about Joan Crawford, right? So madness is very relative in this movie. Situationally relative, and one person can be sane relative to another person and insane relative to a different person.
The defining event, even more than Van Heflin breaking up with her and...
Well, later on, the doctor says that the trauma that sent her over the edge while she was in a precarious mental state anyway, because of this breakup,
is the death of the wife.
Yeah. Now, we do see that she's out of her mind, and at least in her flashback, because Who knows how objective this flashback is? At least in her flashback, she's out of her mind and screaming her lungs out at Van Heflin already before the wife dies. That's why I question whether that actually happened that way, but...
Well, that's where Heflin really changes toward her. But yeah, then this woman who has been just an accusing voice from a bed is dead, and Joan Crawford spends a year behaving basically normally with her husband. Nobody suspects anything, and Van Heflin's away, so she doesn't have that to worry about. But she, in the back of her mind, is fairly certain that somehow she killed the wife or was involved in the death of the wife, and she confesses this. There's so many movies within movies here, right? Like, in most cases, that would be the whole movie. You've got someone whose guilt is just eating away at them over this terrible thing that they've been involved in, but that's just such a tiny part of this, and it's not even true, but she goes through all the emotions associated with that plot as if she did kill the wife.
But she has a variety of fantasies about this. One of her fantasies, sometimes operative at the same time as her fantasy that she killed this woman, is that she's still alive.
Or some kind of undead accuser, yeah.
Doesn't she tell two different versions of the story of how she killed the woman? Like, I think she tells one to Raymond Massey when they're at the house.
Well, the other one it comes out of her delusional encounter with Geraldine Brooks, where she kills Geraldine Brooks, but all in a waking nightmare.
Oh, it's such a absolutely fabulous scene. I just love that whole scene so much. Okay, so this happens after Geraldine Brooks calls Van Heflin over to join her and Joan Crawford at a concert. The pianist plays Schumann, and Van Heflin looks over at her, and she looks over at him. He knows what she's thinking of, and she knows that he knows it. What do you think motivates him to follow after her? She thinks he is just mocking her. Is there some truth to that when he follows after her when she excuses herself and says she has a headache?
Just wants to try to find some way to de-escalate because he's going to be his mother-in-law. Of course it doesn't work.
I mean, he's still trying to make jokes about, you should keep me guessing. You're using the wrong tactics. But again, he just strikes me as somebody who has no idea how to deal with this situation at all.
No, he's trying not to, but he got thrust into it. He'd rather just sit with his friends, even though he's coming to feel strongly about Geraldine Brooks. He doesn't need to go up there. It's just because she waves at him and makes him go up there. He would much prefer not having that scene in the balcony, and he's right. It didn't help anyone.
But she takes this all as just as him mocking her.
Picking on Geraldine Brooks just to torture her, and we can see that that's absolutely not the case.
You have to understand this screenplay, and you have to understand this character. She has a myriad of different fantasies at different times. Sometimes she tells herself that he is just doing this to torment her, or sometimes she tells herself he's doing it because he actually wants to see her. Sometimes she believes that and then 1 second later knows it isn't true. There's no one thing, after a certain point in this movie, there's no one thing that's real for her all the time, or sometimes from moment to moment.
Including who's alive and who's dead and who killed who.
Yeah. Then Geraldine Brooks comes home and she hears the door open and she has this scene that's almost like a night terror.
Well, it's not shot like a dream. We don't know it's a dream until after things go completely crazy.
It's almost like a night terror in that a whole fantasy in the space of a few seconds is prompted by the sound of Geraldine Fitzgerald's return, maybe even from the sight of her wiping her coat off, because she does that the same way both times, right? But it's not a night terror, because Joan Crawford is awake. But the movie does frequently, visually and verbally, associate her psychosis. I don't know if it's accurate enough to call it schizophrenia, but associates her psychosis, her mental illness, with nightmare. That's the metaphor it uses for the audience to be able to understand it's a waking nightmare.
Yeah, you're unable to tell the difference between what is a dream and what is happening in the intersubjective world. So in this night terror, Geraldine Brooks and Van Heflin, they kind of behave the way the antagonists in Mulholland Drive behave.
Yeah,
in
I thought of that.
The second despairing half of Mulholland Drive, where, yeah, everyone's just doing this to make Joan Crawford feel even worse. Like, we fooled her. She's imagining they set up this whole meeting at the concert where it's very clear it's just an accident, happenstance, and Van Heflin wishes that it had never occurred.
Right, and then in her fantasy, Geraldine Brooks is acting very hostile.
He told me all about you and what you did.
Well, that's the thing. What's so fascinating about this fantasy is that Geraldine Brooks' accusations of Joan Crawford are all true things. There is a part of her mind during this fantasy that is completely rational and that understands what she, Joan Crawford, is actually doing and feeling, and Geraldine Brooks voices all of that.
Well, yeah, but she also says that you killed my mother, which is not true.
Right, well, that's how it climaxes. But it starts out with us thinking, oh, isn't that great? A part of Joan Crawford's mind is rational and really understands what's going on here, is onto her. But then, yeah, it climaxes in this complete delusion.
And at that point, we don't really know. It could be true that she did kill the wife.
Guess I never thought that, but...
I can't remember what I thought when I first saw it, but it's certainly a possibility because of the way Joan Crawford reacts in The Night Terror. It just seems like, okay, I've been exposed, I have to kill this person. It seems like something that she's feeling massive guilt over, and she is. But the twist there is that she didn't do it, and she is no longer certain, or she's become certain in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and she's just having all of these guilt feelings, which again is interesting because, most movies would give you that childhood Freudian excuse, that childhood experience that explains why she has all these guilt feelings.
This is very different from Spellbound. If she did accidentally slide down the banister and kill her sibling, we don't see it in this movie.
But then we get, there's so many instances in the movie, like I'm talking about it as a showcase for the Joan Crawford persona, and we just get her a raw brutality that is not really associated with any of the, as violent as Bette Davis and Stanwyck often become in their movies, there's a tough kind of abuser's brutality about Joan Crawford that can just subtly manifest. And she directs it toward Van Heflin, and here she spectacularly directs it toward Geraldine Brooks.
Alongside it, we have the ultra-professional, the shop girl heroine, Joan Crawford.
Yes, of course, the working girl nurse, but also the vulnerable and the caring Joan Crawford, where as soon as she's beaten Geraldine Brooks in this fantasy, smashed her with a hairbrush and knocked her down the stairs, the fantasy ends and she's just absolutely horrified.
Yeah, and then she sees Geraldine Brooks come in again, and there's no conspiracy going on against her. Nobody's whispering. Geraldine Brooks loves her and wants to think of her as a confidant. And they have that amazing scene where she goes to the college and confronts Geraldine Brooks. And, that's like the 1930s MGM Joan Crawford. Is able to, cut through barriers, and just her honesty makes everyone a fan, and she wins over Geraldine Brooks, and she says, I just won't marry your millionaire dad unless you give your blessing. I'll just go back to being an impoverished nurse somewhere else. I'll just shift for myself, and she means it. She's not manipulating Geraldine
I don't know,
Brooks.
I feel like she really is manipulative, though, in that scene, though.
I don't think so. Maybe she understands that this is going to work. If Geraldine Brooks is any kind of a woman at all, any kind of a human at all, she will understand that I'm being authentic here and we're going to become friends. But it does not come across as calculated in any way, I don't think.
I guess so. I just always see Crawford herself as being so actressy.
No.
In that scene.
I don't think so.
That it always comes across as manipulative to me.
Guess we have to differ on that. To me, that feels like the old, unvarnished Crawford, who's the salt of the earth.
I don't feel like Joan Crawford is the salt of the earth at any moment in this movie, I guess.
Well, she just seems like a really admirable person in many ways, and that's why millionaire Raymond Massey falls for her. I mean, he just can't bear thinking about life without the steadiness that Joan Crawford offers. And he really comes through for her as well, as best he can, as things start to go up to pieces. I mean, he never abandons her. He really supports her no matter what he finds out. Usually this kind of character would at least draw the line when he learns just how obsessively involved she still is with the guy that's going to marry her daughter. Yeah,
but I mean, obviously even before that, when he realizes his wife is just full on crazy and thinks his ex-wife is alive, and also that she killed her, and...
Yeah, he's really good with her. I mean, you can't really fault Raymond Massey for anything except, proposing this marriage where he already knows she doesn't love him. I mean, but that's such a convention of these films.
There's an extraordinary scene too, where one of her really quiet scenes in the movie, where he's just talking to her absolutely normally, and we're watching her, and she's flicking the lighter on and off, and then all of a sudden, very quietly, out of the blue, non sequitur, she's just like, "I want a divorce." Right?
Yeah. Well,
wait, what are you talking about? No, I don't know. I don't care. Leave me alone. It doesn't matter. I'm just, we're divorcing. It's the end. It's over. It's final.
He probably should have allowed it to happen, but instead he proposes that they go face this thing and go to the lake house, and it seems to work. Like, she has her complete breakdown, shrieking at the empty bed. This is like the spellbound treatment where the person finds the root cause of the problem, realizes that they didn't kill the wife, and then she's supposed to be okay.
Well, this is also one of the greatest, because obviously this movie is not just a film noir, it's a hybrid gothic woman's picture. And this is one of the greatest all-time classic Hollywood gothic movie moments in this deserted, windswept house where the electronic buzzer,
Mrs. Graham's room,
keeps emitting her name, Louise, Louise, in just an absolutely perfect, it's like no other name would work so well, but just an absolutely perfect imitation of a paranoid delusion of reference. Hearing your voice in an eerie sound like that. Yeah. It's so creepy.
She plays it for everything it's worth. That incredible emotional explosion when Raymond Massey finally convinces her that she wasn't even at the house when it happened. He was. And we don't really ever know if what he tells her happened is what happened, or did he actually kill his wife? Probably not. Probably it happened the way he said, but he's like, I'm in a position to know you didn't kill my wife because I was with her, and then for all we know, he did throw her in. He just got fed up. His solid basis of knowledge there snaps Joan Crawford out of it. They have a great weekend together after.
Well, yeah, I mean, afterwards when they come home, we are encouraged to feel like they, by movie conventions, we're encouraged to feel like for the first time they have a real marriage. They are acting so happy that you believe that they fucked for the first time.
Could be, yeah. Then they go out to celebrate and it all crashes down because they run into David.
And absolutely nothing has been fixed, which is another realistic portrayal of mental illness, parallel to Woman Under the Influence. You think you've got it licked, you don't have it licked.
No, there's no one cure. I guess that's why Stanley Ridges says it's going to take months. I think he means years, or maybe never.
Well, I mean, you've got to throw some sop to the audience at the end of this movie. Or maybe it's just the usual, we're going to discharge her. So that is like Woman Under the Influence. We're going to discharge her in a few months, and she'll be okay.
I mean, Raymond Massey is ready to help her pick up the pieces. Thankfully, he's got a lot of money. Maybe he can just at least keep her under armed guard at all times so she doesn't kill anyone else. I don't know. Is her delusion going to be fixed because David is gone now? I mean, she can't kill him again.
Yeah, well, what happens when this is what the doctor's talking about. There's so much suffering, untold suffering that she has to pass through in order to get better. This at least as much suffering as involved in her falling apart. When she realizes she's killed him. Well, I mean, she does realize it, but then she goes out of it again.
I think that's my favorite scene in the whole movie, when she screams that she killed him. I mean, it's really powerful. It's so sad.
Well, how do you feel about the scene where she kills him?
A great scene as well, and Van Heflin tries to smirk his way through the increasingly dire scenario. First, he's just annoyed with her and makes that remark that you mentioned earlier about how he's going to start kicking babies if she doesn't let up. And then all of a sudden she brandishes a gun and everything changes.
Because one of the things, undeniably, one of the discourses in the movie, established in their first scene, which is called back to, his love of math. Right? Established in the first scene and called back to in this final scene between them, is this idea of a kind of battle of the sexes or difference between the genders. And undeniably, as opposed to something like The Letter, undeniably this movie wants us on board on some level with the idea of her killing him for being a man. Like a certain kind of smug, rational man who can never give in to love in this way.
Right, and he's not going to talk about his feelings. I mean, that's how I've always interpreted it, right? I think he really is in love with Geraldine Brooks, as much as he can be. Joan Crawford starts talking about the money, and he's like, well, this is a good out for me. I'll make some jokes about how I'm going to spend that money as quickly as possible so that it's not coming between us anymore. That just infuriates her all the more. But I remember when I first watched this, I was holding out hope that this was another night terror, and it wasn't really happening. But that's why the powerful shriek that she emits when she realizes, like, that heart-rending coming face-to-face with reality, that is the thing that takes the place of electroshock therapy. Like, it's her emotional coming to grips with the fact that she has killed this man that she's, invested her entire being in. It's so heartrending. At that point, there's no refuge in the possibility that it could have been a night terror. This one was real.
And I don't know how to grapple with the fact that I recognized very early on in my viewings of the movie that some part of us is supposed to be rooting for her to shoot him in that moment. Just for that male smugness and imperviousness.
It's her only way to get even with them, which is terrible. And yeah, it may be a very perceptive comment on the imbalance between the genders at that time. And maybe still, this unassailable smugness.
Well,
There's nothing you can do about it except shoot them.
Well, he genuinely says, I think it's mathematically impossible that you're going to kill me.
He doesn't think she's a good enough shot.
I'll show you math! Fuck math!
She gets her ballistic trajectory just right, like an engineer does. It hits him in the most vital spot, apparently, and he's gone.
And then this, of course, raises the question, do men deserve to die horribly just because they're men? Well, you like that Ginger Rogers movie where she decides that they should all die.
Shot down like dogs. Well, what about After Hours? I mean, that's the plot of that movie, right? That's a good analogy. And I wonder if Scorsese was thinking of Possessed when he made After Hours.
A man should be tormented to death by insane women just for being facetious?
Yeah, he just wanted to go out and meet a nice girl, maybe. Like, do I have to die for that? I mean, that's what Griffin Dunn says in that movie. He's insensitive to the emotional distress.
Well, particularly Catherine O'Hara.
No, more particularly, what he seems to be getting punished for more than anything is Rosanna Arquette.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And everyone comes after him. The closest modern analog to Possessed in a strange way, but from the David character's perspective.
Yeah, we've talked before about what a difference gender makes in David Lynch's movies about killing your lover. The emotions of Mulholland Drive compared to the sort of detached, horrific mockery of Lost Highway.
Yeah, Lost Highway's got much more of a Twilight Zone feel to it, a punishment feel to it.
I mean, do men deserve this? Who knows? It's in the story and perhaps some part of some viewer's response to it.
Let's turn to Dark Passage. We'll hear from Clive Hirschhorn first. The third teaming of Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall in Dark Passage resulted in a fair to middling thriller. Bogart, now Hollywood's highest paid star at an annual salary of $467,361, played an escaped convict who, with the aid of plastic surgery, changes his appearance and hides out in artist Lauren Bacall's apartment until he is able to track down the real murderer of his wife, thus clearing himself of the crime. The magical Bogart-Bacall chemistry, so effectively exploited in To Have and Have Not, was underplayed here, surfacing only during a romantic dinner sequence with the background song Too Marvelous for Words helping to express their sentiments.
Yeah, I wouldn't exactly say that.
Neither star overstretched his or her dramatic abilities, and Agnes Moorehead as the murderess went way over the top. Based on the David Goodis novel, Delmer Daves' screenplay, he also directed, abounded in bizarre secondary characters, and Tom D'Andrea as a cab driver, Housley Stevenson as the accommodating plastic surgeon, and Clifton Young as a small-time crook attacked them con brio. The first 40 minutes of the film were photographed by Sid Hickox, entirely from Bogart's point of view, an interesting device which established the star's presence without actually allowing audiences to see him. Also cast were Bruce Bennett, Douglas Kennedy, and Rory Mallinson. The producer was Jerry Wald.
Incidentally, the cinematographer also shot To Have and Have Not, and The Big Sleep.
And The Horn Blows at Midnight.
And White Heat.
I love this movie. It's my favorite Bogart-Bacall movie.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't go that far. I might like it better than The Big Sleep. I'm not a huge fan of The Big Sleep, but I am a huge fan of To Have and Have Not.
I think I like The Big Sleep more than To Have and Have Not.
Oh, well, we're not on the same page.
They're all good, but no, this is definitely my favorite, and I think this one has an amazing use of Bogart and Bacall. I don't understand what Hirschhorn is complaining about.
Yeah, I mean, this woman's nuts. This woman is risking her life for him for this stranger from the first scene together, so I don't see how that's not making good use of their chemistry.
Yeah, that instant rapport that they have. I mean, the film is depending on the audience knowing that they are a real-life couple and they've seen them together on screen before and they know it's magic.
We get moments familiar from The Big Sleep where Bogart is completely helpless and Bacall has to nursemaid him, give him his cigarette and all the rest of that, so that's important to their on-screen couple persona. Obviously this is not a big dramatic role for Lauren Bacall, but it really makes use of her very well, from the bizarre poise of this character just picking up this escaped apparent murderer in her car.
Yeah, I think this is probably my favorite Bacall performance.
I mean, she actually is allowed to be much more domineering in a way. He's allowed to be much more passive. Hawks likes to play with that idea, but he's also very nervous about taking it too far.
Yeah, no, Delmer Daves is saying this woman is in control and she's the only thing that can save Bogart, and he realizes that and accepts it.
And besides her otherworldly poise, there are also wonderful shots of her emoting in this movie that really made me appreciate what a good screen actor she is.
Yeah, Hawks is not interested in showing that kind of stuff. I think she's amazing in this movie, and I'm not a Bacall fan in general because she didn't get nearly enough movies like this.
Well, I think you like this movie even more than I do, so I'll let you take the lead with it.
Well, it's got so many things that I love. You know, I mean, the subjective camera. This is the same year as The Lady in the Lake, which went even further by having almost the entire movie shot subjectively. Here, it's the first half, as Hirschhorn points out. A lot of people complain about it or say it's no big deal, really, because Bogart's got such a distinctive speaking voice that it feels like you're seeing him anyway.
He has a wonderful voice, but of course it's very risky to not show your box office star for that long into the movie.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason they can do it is because, like Claude Rains in The Invisible Man, his voice is, like, more than half of the reason people love him. It is a big moment when we finally get to see the Bogart face, and everyone's talking about how he's so much older looking than whoever was playing him before. We only see a picture of him in the newspaper.
It is so disorienting to imagine that face of like a middle-aged businessman with a mustache, like a dad, and he is supposed to be a dad type because he's supposed to look just like Bacall's character's dad. That man with Bogart's voice and the whole attitude that goes with that voice is just inconceivable.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's not playing any kind of an underworld type or private eye type or any of the usual things that Bogart was called upon, or even, you know, a mildly disreputable cafe owner. I mean, this is a pillar of mainline country club guy.
Yeah, he's like the real-life Bogart.
Yeah, pretty much. But we meet him escaping from San Quentin, and there are very particular circumstances that led to that. But yeah, he's very at home in the posh world that Lauren Bacall lives in. They traveled in the same circles beforehand, and they know a lot of the same people, including Agnes Moorehead.
Most importantly, they know Madge.
Madge.
You think that would make him more paranoid?
Buzzing around like a hornet, irritating everybody.
But he's just like, everybody knows Madge in San Francisco.
I feel like Delmer Daves, and of course we know he went on to make those amazing melodramas of the late 50s and early 60s. There's so much talk about marriage as a powder keg and inevitable murder going on. These guys are talking about it very matter-of-factly, but I think the film is offering that as critique of the state that gender relations have come to.
As we know from Possessed. Also, you just made me think, you know, talking about A Summer Place, you just made me think of how important that upper middle class Frank Lloyd Wright house is to that movie, just in terms of visuals, textures, and a real sense of the privilege of these characters.
And Bacall's pad is beautiful.
Which is the Mallock Building, a famous apartment building on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco.
Yeah, because there is a lot of location shooting in this movie.
And Daves was from San Francisco.
But before we even get to Bacall, the movie opens with this bold escape. We don't see how he planned it, who he paid off to arrange for these things to happen. And it's kind of endearing, too, that he doesn't seem to have much of a plan. He doesn't seem to have really expected to succeed, because once he gets out, he's pretty lost. And it just seems like he easily could have died. That barrel roll off of the truck looks so dangerous.
And then he gets out and he's just staggering around.
We see him in long shot. That's not subjective camera. We do see the body of this man, but we can't tell that it's not Bogart or it is Bogart. We just can't make out that clearly who it is. And as he starts to try to get his bearings, I mean, he throws away some of his clothing because the hounds are going to be after him. We're familiar with those tropes, but then he just decides to hitchhike. That's all he can do, and he winds up getting in the car with this creep played by Clifton Young, who's some kind of small-time grifter and ex-carny, we find out, because he's got seat covers made from carnival tents. And this guy is just got such a punchable face, and the movie obliges us pretty quickly by having him stick his nose in Bogart's business. He won't stop pestering him, and then the news gives the answer that he's been looking for. There's an escaped convict, and he just gets pummeled in the face and left unconscious on the side of the road.
Well, Bogart is going to kill him.
No, he's not.
Yes, he was. He's picking up a rock.
He picks up a rock because someone else is approaching. No, he definitely did not intend to kill him.
Well, Bacall says to him it's a good thing he's still alive.
Yeah, but he wasn't going to kill him. There's no way. He thinks that this is the police.
I mean, I guess you must be right, because 2 accidental deaths happen in his vicinity just to spare this character from having to kill somebody.
Exactly. This is like superhero morality is operative here. The villain's going to die, but it's going to be by their own clumsiness or misguided belligerent.
Two villains.
Yeah, exactly. He knocks out Clifton Young, and Lauren Bacall drives up, peeks through the bushes, and says, "Come on, get in the car. You're obviously not equipped to deal with this situation. I am. You just better start trusting me." And Bogart's like, "Okay, Miss Bacall." She tells him to get under this canvas that has been thrown over her painting stuff.
This character's just like a Grace Kelly type. She's just an attractive, young, wealthy, amateur painter.
You know, her family has imploded, so that part is a pretty sad backstory, but I guess she inherited all the money because her mom is dead on account of being murdered by, if not her dad, someone else, and her dad died in prison. That we learn later. We don't know why, at this point, she is taking these chances in order to rescue Bogart from certain recapture. She navigates the roadblocks perfectly. Bogart gets a brief moment of paranoia where he's like, "You seem pretty happy to have him look under the tarp." Bacall's rejoinder there is perfect. She's like, "Yeah, I want him to find an escaped convict so I can go to jail with you. That's how I get my kicks."
Yeah, she's very cool. She thinks very quickly on her feet.
From that point on, Bogart's like, "Yeah, you're right. I'm not going to question this anymore. She's taking insane chances. I mean, she can't be doing it just to tease me, so she must really be on my side." And that works. The script has to do that, too, because otherwise the audience is going to be thinking, what is wrong with her?
Well, I mean, you're thinking that anyway.
We don't really know what his backstory is either. You know, you could be thinking at that point maybe he's got some kind of gangland backstory and he's being abducted by gang enemies who want to torture him to find out where some money is hidden or something. I mean,
no, this just seems to be a rich woman with a whim.
That becomes more and more evident, yes.
And that is what makes, even though they do have the Freudian motivation, that is still what makes her character so strange and unique, that basically she is just a rich woman with a whim, who would usually be punished for that by a movie, right?
No, this movie loves her for it, and she's got a sense of humor about it, too. She's like, while the trial was going on, where I felt like you were being railroaded, all I could do was write these crazy letters to the newspaper. She knows it was ineffectual, and she's never had a chance to do very much to affect the world the way she'd like to, although she works at the settlement house 4 days a week, as she tells us. I mean, that's her contribution to society as an art teacher to the impoverished.
when the bandages finally come off too, and we have a little meta moment where she likes him better this way, looking like her real-life husband.
After he shaves.
Right. But also, perhaps, it did make me wonder if she was like, oh, this is good, because before you looked so much like my father that would have been a little creepy, so now you can remind me of my father, but it's not, like, too close to incest.
That's true. It could help a lot of marriages, maybe, that are the result of father figure attachments.
Some plastic surgery by this creep.
One of the wonderful things about this movie is just the way it builds this, I guess, Damon Runyon-esque sense of camaraderie and lovability amongst the underworld types that we encounter, although not universally. Clifton Young is just a monster.
And something that seems to be based on, as you were alluding to earlier, and I guess that dovetails nicely with our discussion about do men deserve to be murdered, in genre terms, in fiction genre terms. These underworld types all seem to assume that Bogart is guilty and not care, and be like, well, that could be anybody. You just get in a bad marriage, and the next thing you know, you've killed somebody.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. The movie is presenting that as the glue of these homosocial friendships that are formed, within seconds.
But how does that work with the movie's complete lack of problem with Lauren Bacall's character being so powerful?
Well, I think it's saying this is really sick that these men can bond like this, but it's also celebrating the tenderness of those bonds between these men. It's really fascinating, right? I mean, the cab driver, Tom D'Andrea, is a really lovable character, and he puts himself in just as much danger as Lauren Bacall does, and he doesn't even have the hope of love at the end of it.
Maybe his father also looked just like Bogart did originally.
Maybe. Sounds like, he's got a good face. So it's like Clarence Oddbody in It's a Wonderful Life. He just decides, yeah, this guy, I'm going to help him. He identifies right away. I mean, everyone's been hearing news reports about an escaped convict, and Bogart, again, I think it helps us to understand his cluelessness, that he doesn't come from a criminal background. He doesn't know how to play it cool. I mean, he is absolutely hopeless every minute of this movie. He's not the unflappable private eye Bogart, and he's not the alienated or, beyond caring criminal Bogart. He's another creation entirely. I think this does stretch Bogart's acting abilities as well. I think Hirschhorn is wrong in every respect in his assessment. This is not like any other Bogart character. Without all of these friends that he meets along the way, it's almost got something of the Dust Be My Destiny feel to it. Right? Where everyone helps the young lovers on the run. This is just everyone helping Bogart.
Well, yeah, everyone just helping... Well, but they have, like we were saying, they have a variety of different reasons. Bacall helps him because she thinks he's innocent, and these other men are happy to help him if he's guilty. Actually, the plastic surgeon isn't, right?
No, that's right. And Tom D'Andrea, the cab driver, does say, well, he told me he didn't kill his wife, and I believe him, and he's got a good face. But he liked Bogart before that.
Yeah,
and he
didn't care.
He didn't really care, but it helps him that maybe there wasn't even actually a murder there. But he goes into his philosophical statements about why he's not married, because he's seen his sister and her husband go at it, and it's just a miracle they haven't killed each other yet, or the husband hasn't killed her yet.
There's a very interesting tone when he's talking to his friend, the trumpet player.
George.
There's a very interesting tone to, I don't know if you want to call it their misogyny or not, because they're very casually discussing how much Bogart's wife hated him and whether or not she hated him enough to frame him for her murder with her dying breath. And Bogart's like, yeah, she hated me enough for that. And his friend's like, but he's like casual about it. He's like, I can't blame her. So she hated me. I know. I don't know why, but she just did. Sure, that's why she did it.
And George says, no, she just didn't care for you.
Yeah, she would have got out if she'd found somebody steady. So they're talking about her multiply cheating on him, but again, not with a lot of emotion. They're just like, oh, this is just the way it is. But no, she didn't hate you. Madge hates you. So Madge is like the movie's misogynist nightmare.
I mean, Madge is clearly going through something not too different from what is afflicting Louise. I mean,
except
she's really fucking crazy.
Except she seems to feel it for any man, but the more she cannot have the man, the worse it gets. So it's kind of like a much less sympathetic version of what Louise is experiencing.
Oh yeah, much, much less, obviously, because she's willing to kill strategically. Like, she just kills George as a pawn. I mean, Louise wouldn't do that.
No, Louise is helpless in the grip of her love that makes her do terrible things. Why? Why do you make me do these things, David?
But yeah, Gert does sound like she was cruel and abusive. I mean, we hear about how he bought her that ring and she took it and threw it in his face and hit him.
So it's like this movie has this fantasy of a perfect powerful woman and then all these nightmares of these terrible powerful women.
Yeah, and some very weak men.
Who just, sometimes might need to kill.
But not Bogart. No, he was just trapped in this marriage. He was resigned to it, and then all of a sudden he comes home and she's dead. He gets blamed for it.
He was offered an alternative by Madge, but that was worse than the marriage. And of course, it's interesting, I don't know that anyone would have known this at the time, but you can't help but if you know anything about Bogart's biography, watch this movie and think about, we were saying he's playing a character who's more like himself than he usually is on the screen, and Bogart was married to apparently a horrible alcoholic abusive wife before Bacall.
Mayo Meteau shot him and knifed him, and I don't think he was great with her either.
But it seems like he would have known something of what these men are talking about.
I think so, yeah. Some method acting.
Real passivity, I was going to say.
It's got these incredible surrealistic sequences when he goes under the knife, the plastic surgery, which is essential to the plot of the transition from subjective camera to Bogart on screen, the doctor who's sympathetic but becomes very sinister in Bogart's delirium. I can make you look like a bulldog or a monkey.
So many of the great noirs of the 40s have these protagonists undergo some kind of terrible physical force passivity, including, one of the most notable ones is in Murder, My Sweet, where Dick Powell is shot up with drugs.
He sees those cobwebs.
So this is comparable to that.
Really? He's just going through typical Hollywood facelift surgery. They can leave his nose alone, so he's going to heal in 1 week. No scars, basically, just tiny little ones. And he'll be able to shave. He just has to find somewhere to stay for a week. And he's all set in his mind. He's going to stay with George, his best friend. And no, Madge has other plans. We find out at the time we don't know who could have possibly killed George. Bogart wonders aloud, why would anyone kill George? There's some really emotional beats in this movie that I've always just loved. When Bogart, he finds his best friend dead. He has nowhere else to go but back to Bacall's house. He has to walk for seemingly hours up endless staircases in hilly San Francisco. People are mocking him from the levels below, thinking that he's just some drunk husband coming home after a toot. And when he finally gets to the door, he passes out. Just like Robert Montgomery passes out in the phone booth in Lady in the Lake.
And yeah, we are left to believe that little Lauren Bacall dragged his body into her apartment. Just more examples of the masculine heroism of Bacall's character.
Yeah.
In this movie.
And of course it's all in the news that there's another murder that's been committed, and when she asks him about it, he can't talk because his mouth has been reconstructed. He writes. It's one of the most emotional little passing of a piece of paper I've ever seen, where he just writes, "He was my best friend." It's like a primal scream in pencil.
Yeah, someone ought to ask him how he feels. So over and over again, people get killed, and Lauren Bacall just has to take his word for it that he didn't do it. That's gonna get pretty unbelievable if we don't already believe in the relationship between these two stars, right?
Yeah. So she takes charge of his recovery, and she has to be nurse and protector all in one. Madge is buzzing around continuously. Bogart, he gives himself away every chance he gets. Madge knocks at the door. He hates her so much that he can't even just wait it out. He actually yells, "Yeah, we're in here. Go away." And he's got Humphrey Bogart's voice. She actually recognizes it, or she's pretty sure it's him in there. She doesn't know 100%, but, it's a pretty good clue.
And then there's this super weird, at the end, where he pretends to be a prospective new suitor. It feels like you rarely see a scene in a movie of this era, at least, or at all, where a man is just blatantly picking a woman up like this, right? A complete stranger walks into her house and says, "Someone told me that, it would be fun to fuck you. What do you think?"
For a good time, call Madge.
And Madge is like, you interest me, you intrigue me. tell me more. I might be into this. It's absolutely bonkers.
Well, this is the nightmare version of the bookstore scene in The Big Sleep, where he works his charms on Dorothy Malone, who's a much more appealing character than Madge is. Although I find Agnes Moorehead attractive.
Well, appealing is another... Well, no one actually debates that. They keep talking about her personality. He even talks about it in that scene. He's like, I've heard you're not so agreeable after you get to know you, right?
And she's like, well, does that bother you? I mean, she just admits it. I'm a bitch. It's true. That's part of what you get when you get mad. Are you ready for it?
Doesn't Crawford have one of her fantastic lines in Possessed is, I can be very disagreeable.
Yes.
David's like, I'm sure you can.
It actually has shades, too, again, of The Lady in the Lake, where Robert Montgomery is flirting with Mildred Haviland, who's pretending to be Crystal Kingsby. Although in that one, it's revealed that she knows what's going on the whole time, and she just pretends to go along with his flirting so that she can shoot him when they get to the apartment. But here, Madge seems to actually fall for it. She's such a narcissist that she lets him in. Bogart doesn't go too long with it. He just can't stand flirting with this woman. Immediately goes into, well, let me tell you who I really am. Can't you tell who I really am? And then Madge gets very afraid.
She's like, no, I was too horny.
It's really interesting because he can't seem to really frighten her enough at first, and she's just taunting him with she confesses to these murders and says, well, your only evidence is me, and I'm never gonna say anything. So what are you gonna do about it, you little pussy?
He has to kill her.
Well, that won't do him any good, though, right? And of course it doesn't. When she dies, it doesn't help him one bit. He's gotta run even further, because it's just gonna look like he fulfilled her prophecy. She's been going around telling everyone that he's gonna kill her, and then she winds up dead. Obviously, they're gonna chalk this one up to his murder count as well, and he's never exonerated.
No, he escapes. I don't know how he's making his money at the end. He seems to be doing quite well in that suit.
Well, you can live pretty well on not much when you've got American cash on you, and Lauren Bacall's given him $1,000 of American cash.
Right, and she's going to bring the rest of her $200,000 along with her.
We build up to that because, okay, Bogart, he's just crashing around, getting captured by the police. I mean, at least he does escape. That's like the one thing he kind of does on his own. But he's just so unable to blend into his surroundings. He gets arrested immediately. After all the trouble they went to change his face, he gets caught after 5 minutes on the street.
And this is another thing about the movie, is that he's just going to live off this woman's money, and this is not a problem.
No, it's great. The movie really portrays them both as these lonely souls who, just like Joan Crawford in Possessed, have never had anything to render them ecstatically happy this way, and it's been worth it to go through this hell to wind up together at this wonderful seaside cafe in Peru. There are more ordeals to be endured because looming over everything, there's been that car with the circus seat covers. Right,
and speaking of her money, of course, this stupid little crook, he actually starts out being, I don't know, somewhat sympathetic. Anyway, it's hard to make Bacall out to be a victim when he originally asks for $60,000.
Yeah, but this guy's too motivated by ressentiment, but it's believable, right? He's like, yeah, I bet I look pretty dumb to you when you punch me in the face all those times on the subjective camera, but I'm gonna get the last laugh. He does get the drop on Bogart, has a gun, so there's not much Bogart can do. There's this extortion threat, supposed to be, as you say, a moderate extortion. I'll leave her $140,000. With $140,000, you just invest it, you can get it back easily. That's a little anti-capitalist statement possibly there.
But he turns out to be too greedy.
Yeah, he has a little slip about the $200,000 that they're going to get from Lauren Bacall, and this is too much for Bogart. And it motivates him to outwit at least one person in this movie. He takes him on a long detour that's supposed to be a shortcut. Clifton Young doesn't figure it out for a really, really long time until they get out to the middle of nowhere and Bogart all of a sudden has the gun, gets it out of him. This guy's been observing and shadowing people throughout the whole movie, and he's the only one that knows that Madge in her orange car has been working the night shift, making things worse for Bogart at every turn, killing poor George.
You just love orange, don't you? I do!
I can't disagree that she's over the top. I mean, Hirschhorn is right
Well,
about that, but it's great.
She's doing a version. She doesn't always do this. She's doing a
Of course
version
not.
of the Magnificent Amberson performance, obviously.
She can be very restrained in Citizen Kane. It's like the hallmark of that performance.
I wouldn't be surprised if Delmer Daves said to her, could you do Magnificent Ambersons, please?
But much less sympathetic. I mean, I feel terrible for her in Magnificent Ambersons when she goes mental. And, well, both of these people that die accidentally with Bogart on the scene, I mean, they really movie really makes you want to see those people die.
Yeah.
I mean, these people really suck.
And certainly the crook has to die because he knows too much.
Yeah, if they're going to get away. It is a nice moment. And again, it's not all over-the-top villainy. There's even a few moments of homosocial camaraderie between these two. They just fall into it. When men are together, unless they're really working at cross purposes, they're going to just try to help each other. That's the message of this movie. Because Bogart escapes to Peru mainly because of the information he gets from Clifton Young, who passes along the tips to getting across the border.
Well, that's when he becomes so relaxed and he lets his real plan slip.
Yeah.
Where he's just, trying to explain to Bogart how you act like a real convict.
They're just two bros hanging out together in the circus car. Take this bus that nobody monitors to a little place in Arizona. The border's not monitored in Arizona either. And once you're across the border, you're home free. As long as you're morally free from guilt, not even the Hayes office is going to come after you, so you can go to Peru and live the rest of your life. It's great.
Joan Crawford, she just completely gets away with murdering Van Heflin. Other than untold existential suffering.
Her ending is not nearly so rosy as what Bogart and Bacall get to enjoy. And it is a very emotional reunion scene. It's not like it's a surprise. We know it's going to happen. But I love it when she shows up at that bar. It's so good.
Noirs often don't have a happy ending. Like, you could even leave it open, a very melancholy ending where we'll meet again someday, but it's not shown. But that's not what this movie is going for.
Delmer Daves wants to show us the full gamut of emotion, and he does. It's really good. And we even get that little vignette of the two other lonely people that are sort of the...
Oh yeah, that's crazy. That's what motivates him to decide to call her and plan this meetup, instead of just sneaking out of her life forever. These lonely people seem to be a maiden aunt who's been left in charge of, orphans?
Yeah, probably. And then you got this guy whose life is going nowhere, and they're both complaining, and they're like, we got something in common. And they start looking lovingly at each other, and maybe they can raise this kid together. And
2 kids.
Get a real kick out of life for a change. And it all happens on the bus to Arizona.
It's a crazy movie.
It's so much better than the book. Because I did read the book by David Goodis. I love old-time pulp novels, but that one, David Goodis I've just never really warmed to. It's not bad. It's certainly a good book, but it doesn't have nearly the memorable flourishes that Delmer Daves brings to it. The whole story is there in the book, but it doesn't register nearly the way that it does on the screen in the hands of a master melodramatist. Time for Fear and Moviegoing in Toronto. We went to see Alien this week at the TIFF Lightbox. It was part of the Women in Action series. It's the first appearance of beloved character Ripley, played by Sigourney Weaver. How do you feel about Alien by Ridley Scott?
I don't think I'd seen it before. I was entertained. I was very impressed because Weaver's character is so calm and rational and always right for the first 3/4 of the movie that I was getting very worried that I wasn't going to believe that she was scared when she has to be. But I did. The performance, she was really giving herself a place to go there. Well, I understand, the woman who introduced the movie,
Robin Citizen.
Well, I understand her making the distinction and saying that this is more like a horror movie than an action film, and Weaver's character is less an action hero than a final girl type, by way of explaining why they hadn't programmed Aliens, the James Cameron.
Well, they wanted to. It's just that they couldn't get access to it.
Yeah, but that had been the plan because this is an action movie series, Women in Action. I think it actually achieves a good balance between the tropes. I feel like her character is scared. I don't know if I've ever actually seen a male character in this position, but you kind of believe that her character is scared at the end in the way that a male character would be. And you see her strategizing very cleverly throughout the whole thing. And despite how terrified she is, she's also still being very rational and heroic in saving herself.
And the cat.
And the cat. There's the moment where you could say that the movie's objectifying her because she takes her clothing off, but clearly the idea is to...
She's so vulnerable.
To hugely emphasize her vulnerability and then have her, strategize her way out of that by putting herself in this protective spacesuit, right?
And she's wearing the worst underwear ever put on screen.
I don't know how anyone could find this sexy.
No, I don't think that it's meant to. It's meant to emphasize vulnerability. I guess someone might find it titillating, but those are not flattering underwear.
Obviously, the movie is making some kind of odd feminist point when the creepy robot is trying to choke her to death with pinup girl magazines.
That's so disturbing. Ian Holm. This cast is incredible. The characters are kind of cardboard for the most part,
sure.
Right? But every single actor in this movie is like a star character actor, at the very least, right? You got Harry Dean Stanton, Yaphet Kotto, Tom Skerritt, John Hurt. The only person who's not like a superstar of that kind, in my mind anyway, is...
Yes, she's Kathy, this incredibly annoying little girl in The Birds.
Yeah, so I don't know her that well, but she was really good too.
Sure, yeah.
And she's got a pivotal role. Robin Citizen kind of described her as more the typical horror screaming woman, but she's not really until the very end. She's very competent for the most part. She's not a liability until she is, when she just gets transfixed. Not like Yaphet Kotto was gonna manage to kill that alien anyway. The movie does frame it as if she gets him killed, because she won't move out of the way. When we saw Terminator 2, I talked about how I kind of came late to admiring James Cameron movies, or at least some James Cameron movies. And same thing with Aliens. I think Aliens is definitely the best movie of the franchise, but all of the Alien movies, I think, have something going for them. And we'll probably do a podcast on the quadrilogy, not the 21st century movies, because Prometheus was really terrible. I did see that in the cinema when it came out. I had not seen Alien in a long time. I've rewatched Aliens quite a few times. I mean, it was amazing to see this on the big screen. It is beautiful. I mean, Ridley Scott is a real visual genius.
Oh,
There's
that,
no question.
That weird giant alien? Whatever the fuck is going on there with his burst through bones. And...
Well, if you want to find out what was going on there, watch Prometheus. There's certainly a lot about that. But that whole final sequence when she tries to detonate the ship and then she tries to change her mind and it doesn't, and it's like a nightmare disco sequence, right? Like all the different lights going. Like, how did they keep all that in frame and make it look so great? It's incredible. Like, that's the most tense action scene ever. It's not like Cameron went and took Halloween and turned it into, the precursor of the most non-stop action movie of all time. He took a movie that already has some seeds of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that sequence really stood out on the big screen. And of course, I'd never seen it that way before. I was too young in 1979 to see Alien. One thing I did want to take issue with briefly, though, they always describe this as truckers in space, and even Robin Citizen described it as that, right? But I think that's going too far. These guys, John Hurt's behavior is what gets them all killed, and this is not proletarian trucker indifference to phenomena. I mean, what is he doing? Why is he fidgeting around with those eggs? Why doesn't he get away from them?
Well, yeah, he's behaving like the typical horror movie woman. Like, why?
He's just so curious.
Yeah, why just out of curiosity is he fucking around? He knows they're eggs, and you know what happens when you fuck around with eggs. Well, I mean, not usually this.
I mean, he thinks that they can't hurt him. He's in his spacesuit.
But at least you might be worried about, like, a mother being somewhere.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so again, I don't think that really flies. This does seem like scientific hubris gone crazy.
Of course.
It's not just proletarians hauling minerals. I mean, the two mechanics behave like truckers in space, but that's it. I mean, nobody else does. So I don't think that's a good description of the movie. The whole plot with the android and the nefarious uses that the military-industrial complex back on Earth, their interest in these aliens obviously is going to be very important to the rest of the franchise as well, but it's kind of...
And are they just relying on somebody to be stupid enough to get a face hugger on him?
Yeah, and it's Ian Holm's job as Ash the android to make sure it happens, right? I mean, probably he would keep them, make sure that the ship can't take off until they finally get a face hugger. What a sinister performance by Ian Holm. It's pretty good.
So creepy. And the design of that robot, and when they take it or blast it apart, it's just, ugh!
The series gets a lot of mileage out of different androids. And yeah, the milk blood that they have, it's really one of a kind. And then, another one-of-a-kind movie, Chungking Express. Our first experience with this movie. I've only seen one Wong Kar-wai movie at all before, which is 2046, which I love. And we do have a Wong Kar-wai episode coming up in a couple of years, but this one's not on it. So we can talk a bit about Chungking Express. It'll be at least 15 years before we can get it on a schedule if we want to.
Well, this is my first Wong Kar-wai film.
Oh, you didn't like it? Oh, I loved it. I thought it was great.
It was so quirky.
That's for sure.
I mean, either you want to get on this movie's, or you are on this movie's quirky, whimsical wavelength, or you're just kind of like, oh, look at the quirky whimsy.
That's how you were?
Yeah, pretty much. It was fine. I wasn't bored.
Oh, good.
But I was engaged.
No, that's too bad. There's no other movie quite like this, that's for sure. It is a romantic comedy of sorts. There are some manic pixie dream girl elements going on.
Well, yeah, but in a very weird way, because one of them doesn't end up with the man at all, and the only sex scene in the movie is not with either of them.
No.
There's no sex with these manic pixie dream girls.
No, definitely not. There's just a lot of build-up, and possibly a happily ever after scenario, it seems like, in one case. In the other case, no, just a brief flirtation at a bar and someone falling asleep.
Well, yeah, and a one-sided flirtation.
It's a really interesting look I found at modern loneliness. It doesn't drive anyone in this movie to psychosis, but it certainly seems like it is powerful enough to do that if it continued much longer. These people are talking to stuffed animals a lot and eating expired pineapple. It could go badly for them.
Modern loneliness, eh?
Don't you feel?
What are you talking about? What is modern about loneliness? Just the fact that people aren't all obliged to get married anymore, so now they're suffering from loneliness?
That you can have an apartment that only you live in. This is a modern condition. Right? And it's something that can happen in Canada or the US or in Hong Kong. That's what's wrong with these guys.
Well, one is only 25, so how lonely can he be yet?
Seems pretty lonely.
But he's only just broken up with his girlfriend, and yet he's already terribly lonely.
Yeah. Well, that's what he had the girlfriend for in the first place, as a band-aid. Ho Chi Mu is his name. The other guy doesn't have a name, right? He's Officer 667 or something like that. 663?
Yeah, 663.
Yeah.
Some people apparently had a great deal, and I'm not going to fault them, because I have certain directors whose movies I have no idea either what happened or who the characters were or how they all knew each other. I mean, this happens to me sometimes with a movie. Some people seem to be very, very confused about what was going on in these two plots. The movies are filmed in a way that's very disjointed.
True.
And there are two separate stories, which could be confusing if you weren't expecting that.
You got the parallel sad boy cops. Who both, as you say, are in similar predicaments. They've both recently exited a relationship, maybe, and not of their own volition. And they're just trying to get back on track somehow and not doing a very good job of it until something quasi-magical happens for both of them. In one case, a longer-lasting impact. Nothing like what I recall 2046.
Then, if this is not his signature style, there may be a Wong Kar-wai movie out there for me.
We'll be doing the trilogy of Days of Being Wild, In the Mood for Love, and 2046.
I mean, maybe I will come back to this movie and appreciate it more when I've seen more of his film.
Yeah, he seems like the kind of director that the more you see, the more you just get in sync with and start to love all of them. That's the pattern I've observed in others. Maybe it will happen with us, maybe not. Anyway, I was really impressed by this one, and Elise not so much.
I didn't say I wasn't impressed. I just said, I don't know, I wasn't on its wavelength. I resisted its charm. It's a very obvious charm.
The only thing I read about the movie is that cover of the Cranberries was actually sung by the woman that played the quirky snack bar clerk, I guess, who is remodeling Officer 663's home. Next week on the podcast, it's our penultimate Lily Palmer Acteurist Oeuvre Review. We'll be discussing Lotte and Weimar and the Boys from Brazil. So that's more Nazis. Looking forward to that one.
Some Thomas Mann and some Nazis?